The Rebel Capitalist Show.
I look at it as three different options or three different scenarios. Scenario one is the system would stay the exact same as it has been. The commercial banks responsible for the majority of quote unquote money creation, but there no more quantitative easing, no more stimulus, no more government or Fed intervention. In that scenario, the system would want to deflate. You would have massive deflation, especially asset deflation. That is for sure.
Right.
Scenario number two is where the system stays the same, but you have increased stimulus up to a certain point. And let's just say and I asked Snyder this question actually one time before. I said, well, what if the government just sent everyone a check for $1 million? He said, okay, well, yeah, that would create consumer price inflation, but it would stop. It would just increase prices to a level, they'd plateau. Right. And then you'd keep going. It wouldn't be this. It wouldn't be inflation we had in the 1970s.
It wouldn't be a 45-degree angle that just continues up to the right. It would be a stair. It'd be a stair step, and then you'd plateau, and then you wouldn't go anywhere again.
But I think in that scenario you would have this drastic increase of inflation, but then you might slip back into disinflation. So it goes up to 10%, but then the next year, let's say it goes down to 8, goes down to 6, goes down to 2, to where we kind of get back to where we are. Then scenario three, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if you kind of think about it, that's kind of what happened after 2008. We had the big downturn, global bailouts, assets went back up, but then, things kind of went sideways for a long time, especially like in Europe. The US recovered better than Europe did in other parts of the world, but, people forget. I mean, this is one of my pet peeves, as you know, is that people just focus on the Fed and just focus on the United States. I mean, Japan's been doing QE for 20 years. Europe's been doing it for 10. They've never escaped the previous crises. So to think that now all of a sudden the central bankers have figured it out and everything's under control, I just think it's silly. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought there.
No problem. Well, I'd like to get your opinion on this scenario number 3. Yeah. And that's where the whole system changes. And I know, see, your job, so you're a professional, so you have to stay within the realm of kind of, what's kosher and what's realistic probabilities, where I'm an amateur, so I can get really crazy and just let my imagination run wild. So let's say the system completely changes. And what I was thinking through is if the Fed has a central bank digital currency, so all the entities and the individuals have an account with the Fed, and that the Fed can start lending directly to consumers. They can start lending directly to entities and create that money supply that the banks have been responsible for creating so long. But the difference is they don't have a P&L, really. They don't, I don't know, can they have negative equity? They don't really have to put that priority on being paid back. They can just issue as much loans or as many loans as they possibly can to whoever can fog a mirror, something like you saw in Japan in the 1980s, as an example. And what's interesting about that is it doesn't affect the federal government's balance sheet either. It's just a balance sheet between the consumers or the entities in the real economy and the Fed. So if we got into that situation, and I know that the probabilities might be low, but who knows? I would have said that about people being locked in their houses in 2019 as well. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think what you are describing is actually going to happen. I do think that that's where we're headed. Now, I would say that the reason I'm always kind of reticent to say something like that is because then people will go out and say, Brent Johnson said that, the banks are going to go away. Everybody's going to have an account with the Fed, and, they're going to give us money that expires, and we're going to have huge inflation. So go buy gold and go buy all these inflationary assets because it's, it might not happen for 3 years. So I'm not, you see what I'm saying? Like imminent and inevitable are not the same thing. And I try to say that over and over and over. And imminent and inevitable are not the same thing.
Yeah, I think, we see eye to eye there, because I always talk about this happening potentially 5 years, 10 years down the road. because at some point, you know what else is interesting too? I went back and looked at the history of the central bank of the United States. You know, the first central bank was set up by Hamilton.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know this, but the reason he set up the bank was not only to fund the government, but also to fund entities in the real economy, to lend directly to businesses, because the banks in England weren't doing it for a variety of reasons. That was the initial reason the central bank was set up. So, I mean, maybe they're going back to, and then going back to that conversation I had with Snyder, he was talking about how in the 1960s, with the help of Friedman and other economists, they realized that the free market, the eurodollar system, had really kind of solved the problems of Triffin's dilemma temporarily. They didn't know how long it would last, but they're like, okay, let's just use this benign neglect.
Yeah,
and we'll just let it
be. That's the perfect way to say
it doesn't exist.
Benign
and then
neglect. Yeah.
But they know in the back of their minds that the central banks are not central to the dollar. They're not in control of the dollar, that the commercial banks are. So wouldn't this be a neat way to take back control of the dollar while at the same time lending directly into the real economy, like the original intention of Hamilton was? I'm not saying that's good. But then at the same time, you get to make all the politicians happy, because you can direct that lending to groups that have gained favor with XYZ politician.
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting. I actually brought this up with Russell as well, because again, this is something I think is going to happen. I think that we are, if you look at the number of banks in existence, look at the trend of the number of banks in the United States in existence over the last 20 years. And it just goes lower and lower and lower and lower. And the big banks, and it's partly due to just mergers and acquisitions, but it's partly due to the number of regulations that have been put on banking systems. And, you know, the small community banks can't afford the legal costs of complying with all these regulations. And so you get, you know, more and more big banks and fewer small community banks. And you end up with one bank eventually, right? But as those, here's where I think it gets interesting, is as those big banks get bigger and bigger, at the same time, and when you get bigger, you typically get more powerful, right? But you know, and banks have had huge influence in both business and politics for years. But as we move towards this thesis that you're talking about, where everybody has an account directly with the Fed, that's talking about bypassing these big, powerful institutions, right? And it, to a certain extent, starts to compete with them and makes them unnecessary. So I have a hard time believing that these big, you know, politically powerful and, you know, economically powerful institutions are just going to say, okay, we'll retire, we'll go, you know. I think there's going to be a battle between, you know, central banks, you know, treasury departments, you know, the Fed, you know, central banks. I don't think it's just going to be this smooth transition, and I don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But it'll, you know, everybody's talked about, you know, Janet Yellen was the former Fed secretary. Now she's Treasury. So Treasury and Fed are just going to work like one hand in the glove. And maybe that'll happen, but I won't be surprised if there's some friction along the way. Because I don't think Jerome Powell and the other central banks are just going to cede power to the Treasury departments. And I think that'll happen around the world too. Again, we're kind of talking about the U.S. and the Fed here, but this is not just I mean, it's going to happen in the ECB. It's going to happen in Japan. It's going to happen in China. It's going to happen in Australia and Canada and Greece, and well, not Greece because they use ECB, but you know, again, it's fine to talk about it with relation to the United States. But it's not just the United States. And the other thing that I think is interesting about this is, again, a pet peeve of mine, if you give me a minute to rant on this, is that I often hear that, you know, China is light years ahead of us with regard to digital currencies, and they're going to roll out this digital yuan, and it's just going to eat the dollar's lunch, and they're going to back it with gold, and, you know, they're going to take over the world. In other words, it's like this positive thing for China. But then when they talk about the United States rolling out a digital coin, it's these nefarious central bankers are trying to, you know, take control of everything, and it's going to lead to the collapse of the dollar, and the dollar is going to go to zero. Now, why does the digital dollar or digital yuan allow China to take over and the yuan to become a reserve currency? But for the dollar, it makes it loses value and loses its status. I mean, it's just the hypocrisy of those two arguments. Just it kind of drives me crazy a little bit. And I don't think either one of them is necessarily good. But the idea that it's great for one and bad for the other, I think is wrong.